The night was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that carried an eerie weight, like the world was holding its breath before a storm. Dwayne Johnson's black SUV rolled into the dimly lit parking lot of the Brass Spoon, an old roadside diner that had seen better days. The neon sign above flickered erratically, casting jagged shadows across the cracked pavement. The scent of fried food and cheap coffee lingered in the air. But there was something else, something darker, a tension that hummed beneath the surface. A row of chrome-plated motorcycles lined one side of the lot, their owners lounging nearby like a pack of wolves guarding their territory. The Road Scorpions, a notorious gang that thrived on intimidation, had claimed this diner as their hunting ground, and they didn't take kindly to strangers, especially not ones like Dwayne Johnson, a man who radiated quiet confidence, power, and the kind of presence that made weaker men nervous. As he stepped out of his SUV, the cold night air wrapped around him. He adjusted the cuffs of his hoodie, surveying the scene with an unreadable expression. He wasn't looking for trouble, but trouble was looking for him. From the far end of the lot, Blake, the gang's leader, leaned against his bike, a slow smirk creeping onto his scarred face. He nudged Tanner, one of his men, muttering something under his breath. The group's laughter carried across the lot, low, predatory, full of unspoken threats. "Look what we got here," Blake sneered, his voice oozing with arrogance. "Big guy thinks he can just roll into our town like he owns the place." Dwayne ignored the taunt and started toward the diner, his boots crunching against the gravel. He had no interest in meaningless fights. He had come here for a simple meal, not a war. But as he reached for the door, he felt it. The weight of their stares, the anticipation, the inevitable escalation. They weren't going to let him just walk away. Inside the diner, a few patrons had already noticed the brewing storm outside. The waitress, Emily, stood frozen near the counter, her eyes darting between Dwayne and the gang. She had seen what the Road Scorpions did to people who didn't play by their rules. But this time, something felt different, because Dwayne Johnson wasn't just another victim. The clock was ticking, the air was thick with the promise of violence. And when it started, there would be no turning back. Will Dwayne make it out unscathed? Or will he have to teach the Road Scorpions a brutal lesson? Watch the full video to find out. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss an epic showdown. Dwayne Johnson, a globally recognized action movie star with a reputation for on-screen heroics, guided his sleek black SUV off the winding highway and into the cracked parking lot of a small-town diner. The neon sign above the entrance flashed erratically in the waning light, its bold red letters reading, "The Brass Spoon." Peeling paint along the siding hinted at the diner's age, and pots of wilting geraniums lined the windowsills, a testament to the blistering daytime sun that punished anything left outdoors too long. Despite this rustic charm, the hush in the air hinted that life here followed an unhurried rhythm, one abruptly at odds with the simmering tension that was about to surface. Toward the back of the parking lot, a formidable cluster of motorcycles gleamed under old fluorescent lamps. Their chrome surfaces, covered in menacing decals and custom exhaust pipes, belonged to a group called the Road Scorpions, a notorious local gang. Rumor had it they savored the fear they provoked and wielded aggression as a tool of intimidation to lay claim to their territory. Above all, the Road Scorpions prized loyalty within their ranks and scorned any outsider who dared to cross their path. The gang's leader, Blake, was a massive figure, thick in the arms and chest, sporting a weather-beaten leather jacket that bore patches testifying to past transgressions. Where others might wear insignias with pride, he seemed to wear them as trophies, living proof of the havoc he had sown and the grudges he harbored. Whenever Blake rumbled with laughter, his men joined in, echoing a brand of arrogance nurtured by an environment where no one had dared stand up to them for too long. He believed firmly that this out-of-the-way town belonged to him, and any newcomer was a trespasser unless proven otherwise. As Dwayne Johnson stepped out of his SUV, he smoothed down a simple gray hoodie over his broad shoulders and wore well-worn jeans. Anyone seeing him might perceive a man capable of handling himself, but not immediately recognize the global celebrity. He had no desire to broadcast his identity here. In these subdued places, anonymity offered a rare taste of normal life, something a man in his position seldom experienced. He took a quick glance around. There was a faint smell of sizzling bacon drifting from inside the diner, a siren call to his hunger. Yet the subtle tang of gasoline and old tires from the row of motorcycles reached him just as insistently. A chorus of subdued laughter rose from the group near the bikes the moment Dwayne emerged. The road scorpions had already noticed him, eyes narrowing with suspicious curiosity. Blake, leaning against his own heavily customized chopper, let a smirk cross his weathered face. Around him, the men quieted momentarily, exchanging looks that conveyed the same question. Who does this guy think he is parking his fancy vehicle here? They saw an outsider, a tall, imposing figure, who walked as though he was on a mission and wasn't afraid of local rules. In their eyes, it was an affront that demanded a lesson. The stage was set for a confrontation none of them had anticipated, one that would transform a humdrum evening at the Brass Spoon into an explosive event. Inside the Brass Spoon, a sense of modest hominess pervaded the diner. Vinyl booths with duct tape patches and scuffed table edges testified to countless years of service. Faded photographs displayed the diner's origins decades ago, a simpler era with old-fashioned cars parked out front and families smiling in Sunday attire. A few customers dotted the booths. A couple in their 60s shared a strawberry milkshake, an exhausted trucker scrolled on his phone while sipping coffee, and a teenage boy fiddled with a half-eaten plate of fries. The overhead fans rotated lazily, stirring the faint smell of fried onions and grilled patties. Dwayne pushed open the door, the brass bell overhead jingling to announce his arrival. He was struck by the welcome warmth inside. It contrasted with the tension-laden stillness in the parking lot. The overhead lights cast a gentle glow on the checkered linoleum floor, while the hushed murmur of patrons' conversations lent the place an atmosphere of calm routine. He scanned the room, selecting a booth near the window. From there, he would be able to keep an eye on his SUV and on the road scorpions, who, he suspected, were not about to let him remain unchallenged. A waitress in her early 20s, named Lisa, as indicated by a faded silver name tag, approached with a friendly, if slightly nervous, smile. Her uniform was a dull aqua color, the material worn thin at the elbows, though she kept it crisp and clean. "Welcome to the Brass Spoon," she said with an automatic warmth, setting down a glass of water. "Can I get you started with something to drink?" Despite the normalcy of her question, her eyes flicked to the window, noticing the glinting reflections of the motorcycles outside. Dwayne responded softly, "Water's fine. I'll have a cheeseburger. Well done, if that's all right." His voice carried the casual confidence typical of a well-traveled man who had seen and handled much. Lisa scribbled the order, but Dwayne didn't miss the mild concern in her eyes. She had served enough tables to sense potential trouble, and from her vantage, trouble had a name: the Road Scorpions. Outside, the men had begun conferring, their harsh laughter occasionally muted by the din of passing traffic. Through the window's glass, Dwayne could make out the silhouette of Blake, the broad figure of the gang's leader, apparently gesturing in Dwayne's direction. It was clear to him that they were talking about him, planning something. He recognized the body language. Men spoiling for a fight. Men who believed they held undisputed power in this small domain. The difference was they didn't know him or what he was capable of. As Dwayne waited, he let the comforting swirl of diner life soothe him momentarily. The hum of the overhead fans, the sizzle from the kitchen, the faint country ballad playing on an ancient jukebox in the corner. Yet he remained aware. Every nerve was on alert for the gang's next move. The fleeting calm, the clink of coffee cups and the shuffle of plates was an uneasy veneer. He had encountered men like them before, both in the ring of acting stunts and real-life confrontations. They lived for the thrill of intimidation, the sense that they were unstoppable. But from experience, Dwayne knew that unstoppable was a myth, and that illusions of power had a habit of crumbling when confronted by genuine resolve. As Lisa retreated into the kitchen to place his order, Dwayne let his gaze wander across the diner's eclectic decor. A set of vintage hubcaps hung behind the counter, presumably from local car shows, and an old neon sign for a brand of cola flickered sporadically near the restroom. The simpler touches of rural life, the crocheted doilies on the back of booth seats, the chipped ceramic sugar dispensers, made him feel at once comfortable and uneasy. Comforted because it was a far cry from the glitzy world of red carpets he typically traversed. Uneasy because the night's potential for violence contradicted the warm environment. He felt the hairs on his neck prickle. Outside, the sound of a revving motorcycle engine tore through the late-day hush. Glancing sideways, he saw a black, skull-themed bike rumble into the lot, likely one of the road scorpions returning from a liquor run or finishing another errand. The newcomer parked next to the existing cluster, dismounted, and was greeted by the gang with a mixture of chest bumps and raucous laughter. A dark sense of camaraderie radiated among them, as though they relished each other's company in the pursuit of intimidation. Dwayne forced himself to remain calm, focusing on the immediate present. He cracked his knuckles under the table, a habit he'd developed over years whenever tension brewed. The day had begun with the simple goal of traveling quietly. That had led him to the brass spoon, but it seemed fate or chance had placed him in the crosshairs of a local menace. A brief memory played in his mind, scenes from his life on set, filming close-quarters combat sequences that demanded choreographed perfection. He'd always prided himself on discipline, learning how to throw a punch for the camera without injuring a co-star, and how to fall convincingly without harming himself. Yet real violence never matched the script's neat lines. In the real world, things could escalate swiftly and unpredictably. Just as Lisa reappeared with his drink, the diner's door banged open. One of the road scorpions, Tanner, a wiry, wolfish man with sunken cheeks, stood there. His eyes scanned for Dwayne, locking onto him almost instantly. The hush that followed was telling. Tension soared and the half-dozen customers took notice. Some shifted uncomfortably, and the trucker in the corner discreetly put his phone away, as though anticipating he might have to move at a moment's notice. Tanner strutted forward, each step punctuated by the jingle of the chain he held. His wiry arms displayed the gang's emblem, a scorpion stinger coiling across his forearm, the ink fading from repeated scuffles. Stopping a few feet from Dwayne's booth, he smirked, letting the chain tap menacingly against the tile. "Your SUV out there," he began, voice dripping with condescension. "Real nice paint job. Be a shame if it got scratched, 'cause you parked in the wrong spot." Dwayne exhaled, choosing words carefully. "I'm finishing my meal. Then I'll be on my way." He took a measured sip from his water, ensuring no outward hint of fear. But inside, adrenaline began to trickle. He recognized the signs of a bully testing the waters, searching for a hint of submission to exploit. "I don't want trouble," he added, letting the phrase ring in the relatively quiet diner. Tanner responded to that calm statement with a snort and a glance over his shoulder, confirming that the rest of the road scorpions were right outside, poised to intervene if necessary. Emboldened by their presence, he dropped the chain momentarily, letting it rattle across the floor. The sound was jarring, snapping the tension in the diner like a whip. A frail older lady near the door looked up, wide-eyed, then hurriedly returned to her meal, trying to pretend she hadn't noticed. "You see, stranger," Tanner said, cocking his head to one side, "we prefer folks to show a little respect when they roll into town." His eyes narrowed. "And from where I'm standing, you haven't shown much." Dwayne carefully placed his cup back on the table. The last thing he wanted was to escalate the situation, but he also knew men like Tanner thrived on intimidation and often read politeness as weakness. He steeled himself. "I'm not disrespecting anyone," he answered, voice steady and low. "I'm just here to grab a bite, then I'll be gone." Lisa hovered behind the counter, anxiety plastered on her features. She caught Dwayne's eye momentarily, silently urging him to exit before things got worse. The young mother with the toddler had scooted a few seats away, shielding her child from the confrontation. The hush that enveloped them was deafening, broken only by the hum of the overhead fans and the clatter of silverware from the trucker's corner booth. Tanner gave a mocking chuckle, as if he found Dwayne's civility laughable. He bent down, retrieved his chain, and coiled it around his fist. "Take your time," he said in a chillingly polite tone, "but if you aren't gone soon, me and my friends might decide to, help you leave." He winked, the threat unambiguous. Dwayne inclined his head in a small acknowledgement, more a gesture to keep the peace than anything else. "All right," he conceded, I hear you. Inwardly, though, he assessed the distance to the exit, the best vantage points if the situation went from verbal to physical, and the potential hazards for bystanders. He wouldn't be the first to strike, but should they force his hand, Dwayne was prepared for a confrontation that could erupt faster than the onlookers could react. With a triumphant sneer, Tanner pivoted, chain dragging behind him, and sauntered back out the door. As it swung shut, Dwayne glimpsed the road scorpions in the parking lot, half of them perched on their bikes, the others standing in small knots. They looked like caged beasts awaiting the moment to pounce. An uneasy wave of relief washed over the diner's occupants. But Dwayne knew this was a temporary reprieve. He exhaled slowly, mind flicking over a mental inventory of escape routes and tactics. In the hush that followed, Lisa approached with the plate. She set down a burger and fries in front of him, her voice catching as she whispered, "They don't usually back off until something bad happens. Maybe it's best if you just leave." Her eyes flickered with fear and sympathy in equal measure. Dwayne gave her a soft, appreciative nod. He began to consider the options. He hated the idea of a violent altercation, but also refused to be intimidated into fleeing. He had faced down bigger threats in real life than these men, though they had no way of knowing that. Leaning back in the booth, he picked up the burger, resolved to finish his meal while calmly bracing for the next move. He took a deliberate bite, letting the warmth of the food ground him in the present. The burger was better than he'd expected, juicy, topped with crisp lettuce, tangy pickles, and a savory sauce. For a fleeting moment, Dwayne let himself enjoy it, but the clock in his mind ticked away, warning that the road scorpions likely conferred outside. They would be deciding how to make their lesson as humiliating as possible for the outsider who had neither cowered nor run. Across the diner, the older couple hurriedly paid their bill and slipped out. The young mother herded her toddler to a corner booth, further from the front windows. The trucker sat tensely, tapping a finger on the table, plainly ready to depart at the first sign of trouble. The sense of dread was palpable. Even Lisa seemed torn between her duties and her urge to usher everyone to safety. Through the window, Dwayne spotted the reflection of a tall figure strolling back inside. The door swayed open, revealing a new gang member, perhaps another associate. The newcomer, clad in a distressed denim vest, looked around. Upon seeing Dwayne, a slow grin stretched across his face. The man ambled forward, ignoring the uneasy glances from other diners. Halfway to Dwayne's booth, the man paused, flipping a toothpick in his mouth. He introduced himself with a mock courtesy. "Name's Crank. Heard you're not from around here." He spread his arms in a showy manner. "We road scorpions like to give out-of-towners a nice welcome." The sarcasm in his voice was unmistakable, barbed with hints of malice. Dwayne set his burger down calmly, wiping the corner of his mouth with a napkin. "Just passing through," he reiterated, meeting Crank's gaze without flinching. In that moment, any viewer could sense the collision course that these men were on, a clash of unstoppable force and immovable resolve. Crank's grin twisted into something vile. "Well, see, we don't take kindly to people who think they can do whatever they want here." His eyes flicked pointedly to the window, where Dwayne's SUV sat parked near the row of motorcycles. "That rig of yours is in prime territory. Might be a shame if one of us accidentally knocked it over." Inside Dwayne's chest, a spark of anger flared, but he kept it in check, letting reason take precedence. "I paid for a meal. I parked in a public lot. I'm not messing with anyone's bike. Don't try to mess with me." A thread of warning underpinned his words, more direct than before. He recognized that these men thrived on subtle or explicit intimidation, and that attempts to appease them would likely be read as weakness. Crank's expression hardened, but he offered no immediate retort. Instead, he peered at Dwayne a moment longer, as though memorizing his face. Then he gave a derisive snort and sauntered back toward the door. "We'll be out there," he said, stepping outside with a final challenging glance. "Come say hi before you leave, if you dare." The hush that followed was broken only by the squeak of the door swinging shut and the low conversation of two men in a booth at the far end who whispered about how this was going to escalate. Dwayne exhaled slowly, adrenaline simmering. He understood the psychology here. The road scorpions wanted to push him until he either ran or cracked under pressure. Neither outcome was likely. He turned back to his meal, determined to finish in peace, even as the noose of conflict tightened around him. Outside, the sun had finally set, its fading rays replaced by the glow of orange streetlights. A mild breeze rustled the line of potted plants by the diner's entrance. From his vantage near the window, Dwayne could see the silhouettes of the road scorpions clustered around their motorcycles. Occasionally, a flame flickered as one lit a cigarette, the embers shining like an accusatory eye in the darkness. The group's body language spelled tension, arms gesturing, heads snapping around to watch for Dwayne's eventual exit. Dwayne took measured bites of his burger, each swallow underscoring the ticking clock until a confrontation became inevitable. Typically, a man might slink out the back or drive away to avoid trouble, but Dwayne wasn't typical. He also knew the diner had other customers who might be caught in the crossfire if the gang decided to bring their aggression indoors. If a showdown was to happen, better to keep it outside, away from innocents. Lisa approached again, clearing her throat softly. "Look," she murmured, glancing toward the windows. "I appreciate you wanting to finish your meal, but these guys, they're not going to leave it alone. You sure you don't want to slip out the back? There's a service exit that opens to a side street." The concern in her voice was genuine. She looked at him, searching for some acknowledgement that her advice might be taken. Dwayne placed his hand gently on her forearm in a gesture of thanks. "I understand your worry," he said, voice kind but firm, "but they just see that as an invitation to track me down. Might as well handle it here." He paused, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Don't worry, I've been through worse." The sincerity in his tone left Lisa momentarily speechless. She nodded, stepping away, though her eyes still flickered between Dwayne and the outside threat. Finishing the last of his meal, Dwayne felt the first real pang of adrenaline gripping his body. He'd been on set for countless fight scenes, had faced real and scripted challenges. But each new confrontation demanded a unique calm. He drained the water and then stood, leaving a generous tip on the table. The tension from the staff and patrons was nearly tangible as he walked to the register to settle his bill. The total seemed trivial, overshadowed by the stakes outside. Quietly, he stepped up to the door. Through the glass, he counted half a dozen men, each brandishing the swagger of someone itching for blood. Some carried short lengths of pipe or chain, while others simply balled fists. A hush fell among them as they saw Dwayne heading for the door, a hush loaded with the possibility of violence. He recalled how an entire crowd could roar for him during a stunt performance, but how silent real fear could be when no bright lights or cameras were around. The doorbell gave a final chime as Dwayne exited the brass spoon. The air outside was still, as though nature itself held its breath. The men parted in a slow movement, letting him walk into the center of the group, encircling him in a half-ring of hostility. Dwayne paused, hands at his sides, and locked eyes with Blake, the largest among them, who stepped forward with a scornful sneer. The stage was now set, the lines drawn, and the cold inevitability of conflict loomed in the near darkness. Blake pushed out his broad chest, arms thick with tattoos shifting under his leather jacket. He was flanked by Tanner, who toyed with his chain, and Crank, sporting a sadistic grin. The rest of the Road Scorpions fanned out, forming a loose semicircle that pinned Dwayne Johnson between them and his SUV. Their posture radiated an unspoken ultimatum: back down or be crushed. The night had fully settled, the only light now coming from the diner's flickering sign and a few tired street lamps. Shadows stretched across the asphalt, dancing at the edges of vision. Inside the diner, patrons watched from behind the windows, hearts pounding as they glimpsed shapes and heard muffled voices. Lisa hovered near the door, anxious to see how it would unfold but frightened by the potential outcome. Blake rolled his shoulders and spoke, voice brimming with malice. "So, big man, you finished that burger. Did you at least enjoy it?" A twisted smirk curled his lip. "Hope it was worth the trouble?" The sarcasm dripped heavily, aimed at provoking a flinch or sign of intimidation from Dwayne. Dwayne locked eyes with him. "I don't want any trouble. I said that already," he reminded them, voice steady. "But if you force it, that's on you." His composure was unshakable. All the bravado these bikers projected meant nothing if they couldn't push him off balance psychologically. He'd seen enough bullies to know that their greatest power was fear, and that once you denied them that, their inflated egos often deflated in the face of real challenge. The tension soared when Tanner, itching for a fight, took a swing with the chain. It was a reckless attempt to catch Dwayne off guard, but Dwayne had trained reflexes that served him well. He sidestepped the chain's lash, seizing its length near Tanner's wrist. A quick yank disarmed him, and a second move, a snap front kick, sent Tanner staggering back. Surprise etched on his face as he toppled onto the pavement. A hush of disbelief rippled through the road scorpions. They had expected compliance or fear, not skillful resistance. Emboldened by his friend's failed strike, Crank lunged with a short length of pipe, aiming for Dwayne's side. But Dwayne pivoted away, hooking Crank's arm in mid-swing and twisting forcefully. A groan tore from Crank's throat as the pipe clattered to the ground. With a final push, Dwayne sent him sprawling onto the asphalt. Blake's nostrils flared with rage, his own men reeling at the swift, almost choreographed takedowns of their comrades. "So that's how it's gonna be," he snarled, stepping into the ring of space. He raised a fist the size of a small melon and threw a punch at Dwayne's torso. Dwayne deflected it with a well-timed block, hooking an uppercut into Blake's ribs in return. The big man grunted, stumbling, though not yet beaten. The clang of metal, the scraping of boots, and the hiss of pained expletives filled the air in a violent symphony. From the corner of his eye, Dwayne spotted the other bikers, some bracing themselves, others too shocked to move. They'd never expected their intimidation to backfire so spectacularly. With every muffled groan or echoing curse, the group's confidence bled away. Yet the fight was far from over. Dwayne inhaled sharply, his thoughts razor-focused. He intended to end this quickly and with as little damage to innocent bystanders as possible. But he'd do what needed to be done. Chaos reigned in the parking lot for a full minute, maybe two, though it felt like a contained eternity. The road scorpions, each in varying states of aggression, attacked in fits and starts, lacking coordination in their frustration. One tried to catch Dwayne from behind, aiming a heavy blow at his back, but Dwayne spun on his heel, delivering a crisp elbow strike that caught the biker on the jaw, sending him reeling into a row of motorcycles. The domino effect knocked over two of the bikes with a clang, fueling the biker's rage but crippling his balance. Nearby, Tanner recovered from his fall. Rage twisted his features as he retrieved the chain. He advanced again, swinging recklessly. Dwayne ducked the wild arcs, letting them pass over him before planting a well-aimed cross to Tanner's midsection. The blow folded the wiry man like a deck chair. Tanner crumpled, chains slipping from his grip in a metallic rattle. Blake, face dark and chest heaving, advanced for another round. He attempted to clinch Dwayne, hoping his raw size could overpower technique. For a moment, their arms locked as both men strained. It was like two bulls grappling, each searching for a decisive advantage. But Dwayne's footwork proved superior. He shifted his center of gravity, hooking Blake's leg and tripping him in a deft move that caused the gang leader to slam onto his back. A chorus of pained grunts escaped the man's lips, his dignity injured more than his body. A circle of battered and disoriented road scorpions remained, shuffling awkwardly. Some attempted half-hearted attacks, lunging in with fists or brandishing short clubs, only to find themselves outmaneuvered by Dwayne's trained reflexes. The synergy of countless hours of stunt practice, combined with his inherent physical power, created a formidable presence they hadn't predicted. Each attempted strike was met with a swift counter, a block, a parry, a punishing punch, or knee to the torso. In a choreographed film sequence, it might have looked gloriously cinematic, but here it was brutal reality. Blood was real, and bones made dull thuds on impact against the ground or vehicles. From inside the diner, silhouettes of onlookers pressed against the glass, transfixed by the shocking display. Some had phones raised, capturing the brawl. Emily stood by, hands clasped to her mouth, torn between fear and awe at the man systematically dismantling a gang that had terrorized her town for far too long. Even in the swirl of adrenaline, Dwayne remained acutely aware of these bystanders. He took care to keep the fight from spilling too close to the diner entrance or onto helpless watchers. Minutes or mere moments later, time was fluid in the chaos. The confrontation wound down. One by one, the road scorpions found themselves on the pavement, bruised, cut, and panting. A few tried to get up, only to stagger and collapse again. The air reeked of spilt whiskey from an overturned bottle, and the broken glass glinted under the faint streetlights. Quiet groans replaced their earlier raucous laughter. The unstoppable band of bullies now resembled a cluster of battered men who had misjudged their target catastrophically. Blake, fighting to pull himself upright, clutched his side where Dwayne's punches had landed. Fury and disbelief swirled in his eyes. He glared up at Dwayne, breath ragged. You'll regret this, he managed between labored inhales. Road scorpions, we don't forget. A half-hearted threat, but it lingered in the still air as he tried to salvage any scrap of dignity. Dwayne stood, chest rising and falling as he regained composure, scanning the immediate surroundings. Broken weapons, chains, bats, pipes littered the area, and several bikes had been knocked over or damaged. The battered gang members lay or crouched in pain, their aura of invincibility all but destroyed. Dwayne's expression, though resolved, carried no glee. He had never taken pleasure in violence, only engaged it to protect himself or others. He turned to see a swirl of red and blue lights. A police cruiser barreled into the lot, tires screeching to a halt. Another cruiser followed, the combined glare painting the asphalt in a kaleidoscope of swirling color. The door of the first car flung open, revealing a deputy, Officer Peters, who quickly assessed the chaos. Men sprawled across the ground, Dwayne standing tall and scattered weapons. "What in the—" Peters exclaimed, his flashlight sweeping across the battered scene. A second officer, Deputy Reyes, approached with caution, hand hovering near his holstered sidearm. The tension inside the diner had evidently escalated enough for someone to call the police, or perhaps passers-by had spotted the altercation. Either way, the law was here. Dwayne exhaled in relief. While he was confident in a fight, dealing with local authorities could complicate matters. But after all that had happened, official involvement might bring some measure of resolution. Blake tried to speak, but only a hiss of pain came out. Another road scorpion, breathless and holding a likely fractured wrist, shook his head in disbelief, as if to ward off the sight of uniformed officers. The group's bravado melted under the inevitability of legal scrutiny. They still believed in their gang's code, but that code crumbled fast when real consequences loomed. Peters angled the beam of his flashlight onto Dwayne's face. "You all right, sir?" The question was a loaded one, implying the officer wanted a quick explanation. Dwayne nodded, lifting his palms outward to show he held no weapon. "They attacked me," he stated in that deep, unwavering tone. "I defended myself." Deputy Reyes crouched beside one of the prone bikers, who moaned about broken ribs. "Looks like they got the worst end of it," Reyes muttered, radioing for an ambulance. Within minutes, the scene was abuzz with flashing lights and paramedics who hastily started checking the injuries. Meanwhile, other patrons, including Emily, stepped out of the diner to offer eyewitness accounts. Tanner, propped against a fallen motorcycle, glared at Dwayne from behind a bruised, swollen eye. The hostility remained, but he lacked the strength to voice further threats. Even Blake, presumably still the group's leader, had lowered his gaze, aware that for the moment at least, he had lost both the fight and face in front of his crew. All that lingered was the sharp echo of consequences, and a sobering understanding that they'd severely miscalculated the outsider who refused to fold under intimidation. Officer Peters and Deputy Reyes methodically took down statements from the shaken bystanders. Emily explained how the road scorpions had threatened Dwayne inside, how they'd pushed for a confrontation in the parking lot. A few other locals stepped forward, some still trembling, corroborating that the gang had a reputation for bullying and violence. Through it all, Dwayne stood quietly to one side, arms folded over his chest, answering the occasional question with succinct clarity. He offered no bravado, no gloating over the battered men. He simply recounted the events as they happened. Meanwhile, the paramedics bustled around the moaning bikers, checking for broken bones and potential concussions. One by one, they were either helped onto waiting ambulances or into patrol cars, depending on the severity of their injuries and their involvement in the assault. The bravado that had once fueled their menacing laughter was nowhere to be found. A quiet hush settled once the sirens died down. The local police finished up, content that they had enough evidence, both testimony and any possible camera footage from the diner, to piece together the truth. Peters approached Dwayne one last time, an air of respectful curiosity about him. "You sure you don't want to press charges, mister?" The officer had just realized he might be speaking to a well-known figure, but the name had yet to fully register. Dwayne gave him a small nod of thanks. "No need," he said simply. "They've learned their lesson for now. Your call on what to do next." He wasn't naive. Men like Blake might nurse grudges. But pressing charges would only tether him to a lengthy legal process in a town he'd likely never revisit. He had more pressing obligations, film projects and personal commitments. Still, he harbored no illusion that the Road Scorpions would vanish from this town's horizon without further rancor. As the night wore on, the onlookers trickled away, some murmuring about how they'd talk of that evening with the unstoppable stranger for weeks. Emily offered Dwayne a bag of hot fries, freshly made, her way of saying thanks for standing up to the menace that had hovered over their diner for months. He accepted with a grin, touched by the gesture. "Be careful out there," she cautioned, repeating the line he'd heard from more than one concerned local. Deputy Reyes walked over, quietly thanking Dwayne for preventing the brawl from spilling into the diner itself. Dwayne responded with a humble shrug. "Just didn't want anyone else to get hurt," he said. With that, he turned to his SUV, which thankfully had escaped the fight without so much as a scratch. The side mirror reflected his own worn face, sweat still beading his forehead from the exertion. He pulled out of the parking lot slowly, the hush of the late hour wrapping around him once more. As he merged into the main road, the neon sign for the Brass Spoon blinked in his rearview mirror. That day, all he wanted was a quiet meal, only to find a group of bullies bent on turning him into a punching bag. Instead, they discovered a man who refused to be intimidated. The night sky stretched ahead of him like an endless film reel, stars faintly twinkling overhead. As he drove on, Dwayne reflected on how swiftly a routine stop could turn into a confrontation. Yet if there was a lesson, it was that sometimes the best way to handle bullies is to show them you're not afraid. For the folks in that small town, the presence of the Road Scorpions would likely remain an issue. But at least for one night, they witnessed a spark of hope, a glimpse of how even the most feared gangs could be undone by a single determined individual. And for Dwayne Johnson, it was a reminder that, after all the on-screen battles and cinematic fights, real-life courage could be as brutal and as unexpectedly vital as any role he'd ever played.